video is sponsored by Havoc, the combat card game, and the Kickstarter is now live. So Havoc is a cards and dice game replicating medieval combat. 2 or more players can create their fighters, choose their weapons and armor, and decide their fighting styles. The full set of Havoc contains 48 cards for handheld weapons like sword or poleaxe, 14 cards for natural weapons ranging from punch to tail swipe, and 10 cards for missile weapons like crossbow or dragon's breath. A really great feature of this is that everything needed to play comes in the box. The 3 rulebooks, 4 10-sided dice, tuck boxes to organize your cards, tokens for tracking damage, and 2 playmats to help manage your card play in your fights. The full set of Havoc comes with everything you need to play any fight ranging from ancient Egypt through the Middle Ages and up into the Renaissance. Havoc is not a collectible card game. Players do not need to buy anything else to build their decks and start fighting. You can play Havoc on its own or use it to supplement your favorite role-playing game and bring your fights right onto your gaming table. Pledges range from as little as $15, which gets you the Roman deck, or you can go all the way up to the $75 centerpiece. You get a range of card sets, tuck boxes, playmats, tokens that record body and fatigue stats, 4 10-sided dice with included PDFs for the quick start guides, and Lands of Sopron. There are other pledge tiers as well. It's available on Kickstarter. If you like medieval combat, historical warfare, as well as fantasy, there's a good chance you might enjoy this game, so do go check it out, and thank you to Havoc for sponsoring this video. Greetings, I'm Shad, and there is a question that's been on my mind longer than you might think that I want to discuss with you, and it's this. Are the Jedi Knights actually knights? Like, when you really think about it? Well, I want to break it down with you because there are a couple of different perspectives we can tackle this question. There is the traditional point of view. Are they justified in any traditional kind of interpretation to being called knights? Or do you need to take a few more liberties to get there? When we look at the historical knight, there are 3 primary classifications that determined them to be knights. And so as we look at these, let's then consider if the Jedi are able to fall into one of these classifications. The first one is really the earliest form of a knight, and that was the mounted soldier. And you might be a bit surprised at that, but that's true. One of the earliest forms of knight was simply a mounted soldier that was more usually in the service of a lord, but sometimes were just lords in and of themselves and had the funds to do it. The chevalier, one of the earliest names for knights, literally means horseman. Cheval being the French word for horse, and chevalier, horseman. This is very analogous to, say, carpentry and carpenter. Carpentry is the act, carpenter is the person, performing the act. Well, cheval is the horse, and chevalier, horseman. And chevalerie was the craft of riding a horse. Chevalerie later became spoken as chivalry. See where I'm going with this? It's an evolution of language where chevalerie meant horsemanship. It evolved to basically mean the qualities that a knight needed to perform to be good at being a knight, a chevalier. The thing is, though, the most iconic kind of romanticized version of what a knight is doesn't even conform to that. But that was the original first version of what a knight was. Another really early version of a knight is tied to the actual word knight, and it was more spoken as knecht, okay, which meant bondsman or bond's servant, one whose service was sworn to another. Okay, so this is where we can see some more evolution in the concept of a knight, because that was also tied already with the chevalier. But when you combine this idea of a mounted soldier, someone on horseback, with someone who had sworn fealty to another, a higher lord more often, you can start to see the formation of the more classical idea of knighthood. Now, looking at the Jedi Knights, they're not particularly mounted. I mean, they might get on a speeder now and then, but that's not a key identifying feature of them. But neither was the knight, of course, when it evolved and progressed a bit further on in the historical period. But what about the idea of having sworn fealty, being a bondsman? Kind of, but not really. The Jedi Knights, they swear fealty to their own order, not necessarily a higher Jedi Knight or noble lords. In actual fact, they're kind of there to oppose the nobility or even the government when they see them stepping out of line. They're a very independent entity, and so for that, I don't think we can say they qualify for this idea of being a bondsman or bond servant. Although there were independent knightly orders like the Templar Knights, the Knights Hospital, and the Teutonic Knights, they did indeed swear fealty to their order, but there was an additional thing that identified them more so as knights. And what is that? Well, this practice of chivalry, okay? Remember how I said it evolved to mean the qualities that a knight needed to perform to be good at their job? Well, horsemanship became a less higher priority in those qualities, okay? And so as it evolved, some other ideals actually rose to be far more prominent to fulfill these ideals of chivalry, which came to be spoken as chivalry. One of the biggest and primary ones was honor and loyalty and bravery. Very key, stereotypical ideals of warrior codes that we actually see throughout different points in Earth's history. There are, of course, additional ideals of chivalry, very much associated with Christianity and, being loyal to God and serving Him, as well as other things that you might be surprised to hear that are somewhat subjective depending on which lord you served. You see, chivalry actually became a more fluid thing that changed between the lords and the people and location where you lived in, where the ideals of chivalry might actually be somewhat different compared to different locations where the knight lived and served. But some of the core tenets of chivalry were those base ones: loyalty, honor. Honor is also very adaptive. What is honorable? Well, that kind of depends. Bravery, and another word that they would use for bravery is valor, as well as piety, righteousness, holiness towards God and the church. But as to what you needed to do to fulfill those things, well, was it always to show mercy on an enemy and fight fairly, or to never show mercy on the infidel? Was it to be refined and poised and to speak well and to attend the courts? Or was it to be hardy and strong and to go on the battlefield and to forego those luxuries as a type of offering to show your obedience and dedication? All those things were actually subjective, and chivalry could change. But the thing that we do need to understand is that chivalry, even though it was somewhat interpreted differently, was a guiding ideal for knighthood. And fundamentally, it meant the qualities that a knight needed to perform to be good at their job. That's really the most accurate definition of chivalry I can give you. And to say that there was a codified list of chivalric ideals that everyone followed is historical bullcrap. What didn't exist, okay? Different knights might have written down certain ideals that they felt was the ideal to follow for chivalry for them, and they might have even tried to promote it, but to say it was the codified, unified thing that all knights followed, no, that wasn't the case. In fact, it was quite subjective, dependent on what you needed to do to be honorable, to show valor, to show loyalty, and sometimes that could mean doing some pretty dodgy stuff if your lord demanded, and to show proper loyalty, that's what the Lord demanded. That was the honorable thing. Or was it to always obey the commandments of God? And if you felt some of the orders of your Lord were against the commands of God, well, then that was the chivalrous thing to do, to obey God and show your piety. So this is where we come to a very interesting thing when you want to adapt the ideals of knighthood to a fictional setting, kind of like what the Jedi Knights do, is that there is a decent amount of wiggle room, okay, that you could apply to it to have a certain order be classified as knights in somewhat of a historical standard that existed. And one of the key things to be able to achieve that is have the knights follow chivalry. And so the way that you could adapt it into a fictional setting is to have a version of chivalry that's appropriate to the setting. The thing is, though, the Jedi Knights, they have a code that they follow, but that's the Jedi code. It's not the knightly code, the chivalric code. Could you try and interpret the Jedi code as a chivalric code? Yeah. So remember the core ideals that are more stereotypically associated with chivalry. You have loyalty. I think the Jedi Knights could qualify as having that, and that's loyalty to the Jedi Order. Prowess, bravery, I think that's a good Jedi Knight quality. Honor, Yeah, the Jedis certainly follow a type of honor code, which is more stereotypically just the Jedi code, but that can be considered an honor code. Piety. This is an interesting one. This is where we get to something that I guess would be up to a bit of debate and interpretation, because it depends on, I guess, which world setting. For someone who comes from our history, okay, piety meant devotion to the Christian God, okay? Christianity, the Savior, Jesus Christ, all those things. That was piety. And any type of piety to any other religious practice outside of that would have been considered pagan and not, no. Chivalry is a very Christian concept. I'm trying to think if there were any knightly orders outside of Christianity, like Islamic knights. There might have actually been, but I've never read and come across historical examples of them following such, a strict kind of chivalric ideal and order, where stereotypically it is more predominantly a Christian concept, and piety meant that, okay? But could you change that? Could you follow the ideals of piety to a religion outside of Christianity? I think it's up for interpretation, and maybe. And if so, then you could try and propose an argument that the Jedi Code is actually a legitimate concept or interpretation of chivalry. And where this gets more weight is if you consider the actual Star Wars universe. If you were to step inside that universe, the objective true religion of that universe is the Force. The Force is basically a type of objective God in that world that they can get direct evidence from using the Force that this is very much real, and they are following the ideals of the light side of the Force. Okay? And the light side of the Force, legitimately, if you do certain actions, you get closer and more in line with the light side. If you do certain bad actions, you get closer to the dark side. And so as a result, you could figure out objective standards of behavior that are basically dictated from the in-universe concept of deity in the Star Wars universe. And so therefore the most appropriate type of piety and deity to apply to a knightly order that one of the core ideals was piety, to be loyal and righteous to your God, would actually be the Force. The light side of the Force would be the most objective standard for the piety these knights would then be expected to follow. And in that sense, okay, you are hitting some of the core chivalric ideals that identified chivalry with the room of interpretation as well, which is loyalty, valor, bravery, piety, honor. Like, if you're hitting those things, you basically have chivalry in a very thin sense, because remember, there was additional concept of chivalry, but that's where we get into the more subjective things about, always being honourable to the opposite gender, the lady fair, the dames, the damsels and stuff, showing poise and respect in noble settings, seeking glory in tournaments and so on and so forth. You can find those elements in many different interpretations of chivalry, but they're not universally tied, because there are examples where those things were less prominent to completely ignored. They were the subjective elements of them. And so if you really whittle it down to the base standards of chivalry, the Jedi Knights can be seen as following a code of chivalry. And in that sense, they could be called knights if they actually called it chivalry. The word association is more important than you might think. Knights and chivalry, they tend to need to go hand in hand. And if you were not chivalrous, you were not considered knightly. So in broad overview, remember those three standards, it was one, a horseman. Jedi Knights aren't that. A bondsman, the bondservant, they're not really that. But a soldier that followed the code of chivalry, maybe. And this, I think, is going to come to your own interpretation. I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are in the comments below. The Jedi Code can be considered a type of chivalry according to the most basic standards, except for the name association. They actually don't call it chivalry. So do you think that then disqualifies them from being able to be called legitimate knights, to have the standard of this is a knight? Or do you think it's okay? It doesn't need to be called chivalry so long as it qualifies enough with the base standards of chivalry, and they can then call it whatever they want. They call it the Jedi Code. That then still qualifies them as being called knights. It's a very interesting topic that has some really fun historical points of reference that we can consider. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Is the Jedi Code a chivalric code? My own take, if they're not calling it a chivalric code, not necessarily. This is why Bushido is not chivalry, even though there are some really strong parallels between the samurai code and the chivalric code, though there is a more disqualifying thing in regards to piety. The samurai code was more identified by honor and loyalty, with lesser an emphasis on the religious application and association to it, whereas chivalry that religious association is very important for chivalry. And so technically the Jedi Knights, they are closer knights than the samurai were to knights, because they have that religious piety as a central core element of their order, their practice, their code. So maybe it's a complex thing. It's just that if they just called it the Jedi Chivalric Code or the Chivalric Code of the Force or something like that, it would absolutely qualify it. And I'm a bit of a purist in that sense, but it might not, follow through with, maybe it's not as important as long as they follow things. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you'll join me here on the next video on Shadiversity. So until that time, farewell.